This presentation, presented by JJ and I, will explore the experiences and significance of the first Aboriginal Australian military aviator, Leonard Waters. Significantly, this presentation will illustrate an understanding of the socio, historical, and political context of Len Waters, as well as explore his impact on Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders communities today. This presentation will begin exploring Waters' life, background, and education, following his significant achievements. It will conclude with an evaluation on how Waters has impacted the contemporary Indigenous community.
Leonard Victor Waters, also known as Len Waters, was born on the 20th of June 1924 at Uraba Mission, near Bumi in northern New South Wales, and unfortunately passed away on the 24th of August 1993 at the age of 69 and was buried in St. George Cemetery. Waters was the fourth of Donald and Grace Waters' 11 children and was fascinated by the idea of becoming an aviator from a young age due to aviators such as Charles Kingsford Smith, Amy Johnson, Bert Hinkler, and Charles Lindbergh, whose tales of aviation were admired by many. This admiration would be a crucial factor in Waters' life due to the historical context at the time. During these times, the world was in a chaotic state as World War II was about to take place. World War II was a dark period of time in world history where bloodshed, brutality, militarism, and savagery was common. In Australia's perspective, the Germans invaded Poland, which made Great Britain take action by declaring war against Germany. Australia allied themselves with Great Britain, and so on September 3, 1939, Australia's Prime Minister announced that they would also participate in World War II in support of Great Britain. Waters saw this war as an opportunity to break free from the domination of the Australian society and decided to join the army, in which he successfully became a military aviator and a fighter pilot. However, his journey to becoming what he is known as today in the military was not easy and full of adversities. Prior to this, Waters had a surprisingly tedious life. He grew up at Nindigully near St. George, Queensland, and was educated to the 7th grade at Nindigully State School, in which he received little education, as he dropped out before he was 14 to work alongside his father as a ringbarker and eventually a shearer. He got a chance to pursue his dream and follow the footsteps of his childhood heroes during 1942 when he enlisted with the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF in short, which was the start of his challenging path to achieving his dreams. He graduated in 1944 as a pilot. During his time in the Army, Waters and his plane P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter Black Magic would gain many significant achievements for which he will be recognized and praised for, especially by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. He proceeded to become the first Aboriginal Australian military aviator and the only fighter pilot in the Royal Australian Air Force during World War II. During his service, he flew a total of 95 missions, most of them being close air support missions. One of his notable missions included his plane being struck by a 37mm cannon shell that got embedded in the cockpit of his plane, which fortunately didn't detonate. Waters then proceeded to fly 2 more hours while the cannon shell was engraved in the cockpit and safely landed at his base while warning everyone of the dangers of the shell. Waters had attained an honorable rank of warrant officer towards the end of the war and was discharged from the RAAF in 1946. Although Waters was known during his time of service, after his time with the Army, he had no choice but to go back to being a shearer, while not receiving the benefits one would usually receive after serving in the Army. This is due to lack of financial backing from the government, as well as racism and discrimination. This is because of the social-cultural context at the time. During this period of time, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were discriminated against and suffered disadvantages in the Australian society, causing them to be dominated and alienated, which resulted in loss of identity and culture. Such disadvantages include restrictions on movement, residence, employment, and access to services and citizenship. The Australian government and society had committed many horrifying acts towards the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community and had not acknowledged it and continued to do so during these times. which caused the animosity between both parties to grow. This discrimination started during the late 70s and is still present today. However, although discrimination still exists today from the Australian society, the Australian government and private organisations are trying their best to redeem their past mistakes, which can be recognised from the national apology of the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, on behalf of the Australian Parliament. In the end, it was evident that Walter's legacy wasn't completely forgotten. In remembrance of him, some places were named after his name, such as Len Walters Street, Leonard Walters Park, and Len Walters Plains.
Since Australian colonisation in 1778, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders Australians have been subject to negative stereotyping. Reinforcing this point, Indigenous Australians are perceived to be alcoholics, uneducated, primitive, nomadic, and of a low socio-economic status. Ultimately, Len Waters has impacted the broader Indigenous population and has considered to be a positive role model to many. The achievements and success of significant Indigenous persons such as Len Waters challenge the perspectives held by the majority, bringing hope and ambition to the Indigenous culture. Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders persons have made numerous positive developments over the past decade. For example, studies show years 7 to 12 secondary school retention rates for Indigenous students have improved over the last 10 years from 35% in 1999 to 45% in 2009. Similarly, there have been improvements in Indigenous employment rates also, with Indigenous employment rates increasing from 48.2% to 49.1% between 2008 and 2019. Although Len Waters was only educated until the 7th grade, he consistently demonstrated drive and commitment to his work, supporting his family as he worked alongside his father as a ringbarker. Whilst most careers today require tertiary qualifications, other areas of work can be achieved through dedication and devotion to the development of a specific set of skills. Subsequently, persons such as Len Waters have impacted the broader Indigenous community by inspiring Indigenous generations to work towards achieving their goals and passions reflected through the rising school retention and employment rates. Additionally, Len Waters has impacted the broader Indigenous community by encouraging individuals to remain connected to their beliefs and to continue out significant cultural practices. Whilst Waters carried out his duty as a fighter pilot in the Royal Australian Air Force during World War II, he spent his military leave carrying out his regular hobbies, such as emu carving. Since colonisation, there has been a significant focus on assimilating Indigenous Australians. This has been enforced through policies such as the assimilation policy implemented in 1951. The purpose of this policy was to remove Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander persons from their culture and beliefs, forcing communities to live in the likeness of the majority. Len Waters' commitment to his culture throughout his life encourages Indigenous communities today to continue to practice their culture and beliefs. These include oral storytelling, the practices of music and dance, as well as arts and crafts, for example, the traditional dot painting and basket weaving. Subsequently, Len Waters is influential in taking part in improving retention and employment rates, as well as Indigenous individuals' connections to their country, spiritually, and beliefs. These improvements have cascading effects in the Indigenous communities and improving the ability to meet national minimum standards in regard to literacy and numeracy, as well as health, safety, and outcomes. Although Indigenous Australians are significant persons, such as Len Waters, they have greatly impacted Indigenous communities. It is important to consider that there are still issues of racial discrimination prevalent in today's impacting the Indigenous population. For example, Aboriginal defendants are 11% more likely to be refused bail in comparison to white Australians. Ultimately, racism has proven to have profound mental and physical effects on the Indigenous communities. A study conducted in 2016 reported that 95% of Indigenous persons in Australia are affected by suicide. These suicides are often linked to discrimination, prejudice, and just bias towards the minority groups. Subsequently, there is a need for both Australian government and broader society to overcome their negative perspectives towards the minority and instead continue working towards closing the gap, appreciating that all Indigenous persons have the potential to succeed, akin to Len Waters.